I speak now as the psychologist, not the partisan. When a public figure is struck down in daylight, in the middle of speech, the bullet tears more than flesh. It tears the veil that covers a society's unconscious. The event is singular, one person wounded or killed in one place at one time, yet the psychic tremor it releases belongs to all. The psyche is a field. It is never merely private. So when America witnesses the shooting and reported assassination of Charlie Kirk during a campus appearance at Utah Valley University on the 10th of September, what you are seeing is not only the injury of a man, but the eruption of a collective image that had long been pressing upward from below. The shadow of the body politic announcing itself in blood and panic. Reports describe an outdoor event, a single sudden report, the neck or head struck, chaos among the crowd, ambiguous initial information about suspects, and a wave of political and media responses that tried desperately to assign meaning before the psyche had even taken its first breath after shock. Some dispatches speak flatly of assassination. Others chart the sequence from shooting to death. Still others capture the confusion of custody claims and the volatility of rumor in the first hours. If you want to understand the psyche, attend carefully to this ambiguity. Language lunges for certainty, because the unconscious, once awakened, is frightening. In the earliest moments, Reuters emphasized the basic scene, a shot from a nearby building, a fallen speaker, a campus thrown into turmoil, while other outlets moved quickly to the language of political murder and martyrdom. The convergence of video evidence, eyewitness accounts, and official statements generated a coherent core, an onstage shooting during a Kirk talk. But the periphery churned with unconfirmed details, changing claims about custody, and the alarming acceleration toward definitive narratives. For the psychologist, the key datum is not the identity of the assailant, though justice must find it, but the symbolic placement. A bullet interrupts speech, logos pierced by force. It is an ancient motif. In myth, the tyrant fears the prophet, because the prophet speaks a name that unmasks power. In modern political theater, factions fear the microphone that mobilizes the crowd. When speech is halted by violence, people intuits that the common word is endangered. The psyche knows this before the intellect can say why. Here the shadow enters. I use that word to describe the disowned, unacceptable, and repressed contents of the personality rage, fear, lust for dominance, the wish to humiliate, the despair that cannot be confessed without shattering the ego storyline. But shadows are not only personal, they are also collective. A nation has a persona, its advertised face, and the shadow, which is the ledger of deeds and wishes it refuses to acknowledge. America's persona declares itself a republic of debate, a marketplace of ideas, a stage where voices clash but live. Its shadow contains the repeated fantasy that the other can be eliminated instead of understood, that the hated figure can be removed like a stain, that history can be purified by the silencing of a single throat. When a nation grows unable to imagine transformation by discourse, it regresses to the oldest magic. Blood will bind and cleanse. Reports and reactions in the hours following the shooting reveal the psychic automatisms of a polarized epoch. Allies call for prayer, and elevate the fallen to symbolic status. Opponents, at least the most damaged among them, traffic in gloating or conspiracy, and the median crowd scrolls the footage again and again, dosing itself on horror until numbness arrives. Every such act, whether sanctimonious or cynical, risks serving the same archetype, the sacrificial crisis. Leaders within Utah and nationwide immediately framed the act as political assassination and an intolerable escalation of violence in public life, while live updates traced the pattern connecting this attack to other recent political shootings and attempts. The compulsion to place the event within a chain is healthy at one level, patterns teach. At another, it risks a dark contagion. Each naming of assassination can, in certain psyches, transmute into suggestion. If you ask what this reveals about the left or the right, you have already fallen for the ego's favorite trick. The shadow is everyone's. In my work, I spoke of projection. We deposit into the rival what we cannot face in ourselves. A nation does the same. Conservatives look upon progressives and see authoritarian silencing dressed up as tolerance. Progressives look upon conservatives and see authoritarian silencing dressed up as order. Each is half right and therefore fully trapped. The assassination of a conservative figure becomes proof for many of a cultural pathology that has for years flirted with dehumanization of opponents, but to stop here would be cowardice. The same is true in mirror image when violence strikes liberal icons. The crowd performs the same rites with the names inverted. The ritual is not partisan, it is archetypal. Consider the speed with which the contemporary media environment constructs a myth within hours. You could read epitaphs, enemy lists, theories of the mind behind the scope, gallows humor memes, and beatified portraits of the fallen. One outlet publishes a bracing eyewitness account, another a rolling live chronicle of official and semi-official statements. The third mobilizes the word assassination with the moral gravity it deserves, while local and national leaders condemn the act and promise justice. Language hardens, rôle congèle, the psyche sighs with relief. We are again in a familiar drama, but the speed is itself part of the shadow, for the hunger to resolve ambiguity into story can license further cruelty. If truth is a slow-growing tree, outrage is a flesh fire. Let us stay for a moment with the physical image, a campus canopy, an open microphone, sun and wind, a person seated or standing and expounding, a crowd murmuring, and then the crack, the body falls, blood at the neck, the throat, a passage of breath and word opened by metal. Psychosymbolically, the site matters. The neck is a liminal bridge between head and heart, thought and feeling, policy and flesh. Wounding it is a gesture from the abyss. We will not debate. We will sever. You must feel the archaic force that speaks through such an act. It is not merely one individual psychosis or malice. It is a field phenomenon amplified by years of psychic, priming rhetoric that treats rivals as pests or demons, memes that eroticize domination, an economy of attention that rewards the most performative cruelty. No faction is innocent of this. Innocence would require silence, and no one is silent anymore. Political violence the officials call it, and they are correct. But if you imagine that the cure is legal alone, more agents, more surveillance, more rapid response, you will miss the deeper economy. In depth psychology, we speak of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to run into their opposites. A culture that prizes speech beyond all things can flip, under the pressure of its own hysteria, into the wish to annihilate speech that threatens its identity. A culture that champions freedom can become captive to the compulsions of spectacle. A culture that calls itself rational can be governed by the most irrational gods. This is not a paradox to be solved, but a rhythm to be recognized. Without recognition, compulsion rules. To understand the specific meaning of this assassination within the American psyche of 2025, we must place it among other shocks and near shocks, among prior attempts on leaders and famous figures, among mass trauma events where politics and myth fused and spilled into the streets. Live coverage explicitly does this, situating the Kirk shooting on a continuum with recent assassinations and attempts, suggesting a pattern of escalation and a normalization of the unthinkable. I warn you, to normalize is not only to accept, it is also to ritualize. When the culture's shared imagination expects the bullet, some among the unwell or the possessed will volunteer to carry the expectation to fulfillment. What then is the task for the individual soul who looks upon this event with horror, but also with the dim sense that it is part of a larger sickness, individuation? The work of becoming who you are begins by reclaiming the shadow. That means naming without euphemism the impulses within you that dream of silencing the rival by force, that enjoy the spectacle of the enemy's humiliation, that mistake the momentary rush of self-righteous certainty for moral insight. The ego will protest. It prefers to be only victim or only avenger. But the soul grows by integrating the first public duty, therefore, is private. Stop feeding your shadow the diet of daily contempt it craves. The second duty is public. Refuse the rhetoric that makes murderers plausible by making opponents monsters. You do not persuade the possessed, but you can starve the field of some of its electricity. Mourn the man, attend to his family, his colleagues, his audience, his detractors who now must reckon with the cost of their own words. Mourn the wound in the civic body. And then ask the question that most frightens partisans: how have I helped to make a world in which this feels to someone like a meaningful act? If you cannot bear the question, you are not free of the archetype that just showed its face. Projection, scapegoats, and the crowd's dark alchemy. Projection is the first law of political psychology. What a person, movement, or nation cannot admit within becomes an accusation hurled outward. After the shot in Orem, projection erupted instantly across networks. The left's rhetoric did this, the right's radicalization did this, the president's language did this, the media's business model did this, the universities did this, the gun laws did this, the deep state did this, the counter-deep state did this. Some blame must someday be allocated with legal precision, but the collective psyche first seeks catharsis, and catharsis is faster when a scapegoat is ready at hand. I coined no scapegoat theory, but I knew its power. The community alleviates inner conflict by assigning evil to a vessel, a person or group, then symbolically or literally expelling or killing that vessel. In the digital era, the expulsion is reputational and rhetorical before it is physical. Yet the appetite for physical consummation does not vanish. One can see in the early hours a competition to name the vessel, the other party. That talker, this law, those voters, that agency, even the culture of free speech itself, and with the naming comes the relief that always follows magical thinking. Now we know. Notice how quickly some commentary leapt from fragmentary police statements to global conclusions about who America is and who must be punished to restore it. Leaders and media framed it as assassination, some carefully, some emphatically. Governors called for lowering the temperature, while others spoke with the absolute voice of moral judgment. The crowd, meanwhile, metabolized the shock by sharing the clip, writing the epitaph, and crafting interpretations that began to harden into doctrine within hours. But to understand what such events do to a polity, look at the alchemy of the crowd. A crowd is not merely many individuals in one place. It is a psyche with its own appetites. The crowd loves clarity, hates ambiguity, and thrills at reenactment. In the wake of the Kirk shooting, live update threads, obituaries, political reactions, and timelines formed a script into which millions could plug their outrage and grief. If you felt a compulsion to check for new developments every few minutes, you were feeling the crowd psyche recruiting you. Crowds crave escalation. They demand a new detail, a new enemy, a new proof that the world is exactly as their fear painted it. Responsible outlets emphasized the knowns and unknowns and the tragic through line. Others moved, perhaps too swiftly, to the rhetoric of world historical martyrdom, or to the intoxicating drama of "this is the moment everything changed." The psyche adores that sentence because it licenses the suspension of ordinary moral restraints. Let us speak clearly about Charlie Kirk's place in the American imagination. He was a polarizing figure, admired as an energizer of youth on the right, criticized as an accelerant of polarization, a prolific advocate and organizer whose campus appearances functioned as political liturgy. The ritual form is important. A charismatic speaker, a stage, a crowd, a counter crowd nearby online, a narrative of national decline and renewal, an invitation to join the drama. To his admirers, he offered agency, identity, and an enemy to struggle against. To his critics, he epitomized a style of politics that fused persuasion with provocation. This is not to assign fault, but to name the archetype, the orator who awakens a tribe. When such a figure is wounded or killed, the tribe experiences a sacred horror and a temptation to vengeance. If you are tempted to answer, but the other side speakers are worse, you are already inside the pattern I am describing. The archetype does not care which banner is raised. It cares that the banner becomes the self. Coverage documenting how Kirk built his organization and influence in recent years, and how his campus tour was framed, helps us see why the symbol cut so deep and why reactions were so immediate and intense. In the American shadow lie two especially dangerous fantasies. The first is the fantasy of purifying violence, the belief that a single act can restore a fractured order by eliminating its antagonist. Assassinations always flirt with this fantasy. They propose that history possesses a simple switch labeled off, and that some brave or monstrous hand can flip it. The second fantasy is the myth of invulnerability, the belief that we, the righteous, cannot be touched. When invulnerability is punctured, the psyche often rebounds into inflation. Righteous fury, maximal demands, talk of apocalypse. Public statements after this shooting include both the cleansing fantasy, this proves what they are, we must act now, and the inflationary rebound. This is the final unmasking. Nothing will ever be the same. Some leaders, to their credit, have instead spoken to the need to lower the temperature and reject violence categorically. The psychologist sees in these opposed responses the battle for a nation's soul. A complicating factor is the informational fog. Early conflicting reports about suspects, custody, and even the sequence of medical updates illustrate a motif I observed in patients under trauma. The mind seizes on fragments and constructs a protective narrative that may later have to be dismantled. When media ecosystems do the same at scale, the result is a miststorm. Thousands of micro-narratives colliding, consolidating, and canonizing within hours. The responsible citizen must learn the difficult art of apophatic knowing, knowing what is not yet known, and refusing premature closure. Reputable live coverage and witness accounts can anchor this practice, but even they must be held provisionally in the first 24-48 hours, because the unconscious loves to paint in bright colors atop unfinished sketches. I anticipate the objection. Isn't it obvious who's to blame? Look at the rhetoric of X, look at the threats against Y, look at the last years of incitement. It is indeed necessary to trace causal lines. Specific people speak specific incendiary words that contribute to specific climates in which specific dangerous individuals feel licensed. But the clinical insight adds a layer. Climates do not excuse acts, yet climates pattern them. Your slogans and memes, your casual dehumanizations, your nightly appetite for the humiliation of the rival, these form the psychic weather. The assassin breathes that air. He is not caused by you, but he inhales what you exhale. The humility to confess this is the beginning of depolarization. The lack of it is consent to further blood. The great danger after a political killing is the unification of a block around its shadow. How does that happen? First, by immediate identification of a total enemy. They did this. Then by moral licensing. Because they did this, anything we do is justified. Then by ritual acts of purification, mass denunciations, digital pillorying, legislation framed as revenge, and finally by a new equilibrium in which the violent imagination becomes ordinary. There are already signs, in the way some commentary rushes to the language of cosmic battle, that the block shadow is on the move. There are also countersigns calls for sobriety, insistance on du process, recognition of the tragedy without transmuting it into total miss. Which voice wins will shape the next decade. The most difficult medicine is personal. Ask, whom do I need to become for my political adversary to survive my victory? If your answer is no one, I want them gone, then you have discovered the assassin within. Jung said we meet the self by passing through the shadow, which means we must first admit that the dream of annihilating the other is our own dream, democracy is not a sacrament of niceness. It is a discipline that demands the sublimation of this dream into lawful struggle. The strongest man is not the one who can kill, but the one who can endure the existence of the rival without needing to imitate him. Archetypes in motion. The martyr, the trickster media, and the wounded king. When I looked at dreams during times of civic upheaval, I often saw ancient figures wearing modern clothes. The same is true of public life. After a killing, three archetypes tend to appear at once: the martyr, the trickster, and the wounded king. Each now moves across America's psychic stage. The martyr is the one whose death promises meaning to his community. Meaning is the most addictive substance in politics. It makes grief bearable and turns rage into purpose. In the case of Charlie Kirk, obituary-style pieces, für instant mémorial, and elevated rhetoric convert a living activist into a symbol. The danger is not mourning. Mourning is human and necessary, but mythic inflation. The temptation to treat the death as a consecration for future offensives. Many outlets took care to balance human biography with the bare facts of the event. What happened? Where? How much remains unknown, while others moved toward the totalizing frame. This assassination reveals the true face of the enemy. We must now do X. The psychologist urges ritual without weaponization, remembrance without recruitment. The trickster today is the media ecosystem itself, by which I mean not the press, but the total circulation of clips, captions, takes, and lives. The trickster's gift is speed. His curse is distortion. In the hours after the shot, the trickster flooded the zone with breathless updates, contradictory claims, premature obituaries or confirmations, and hypermoralized interpretations. Even responsible platforms running live blogs necessarily transform a fluid situation into a narrative with momentum. And momentum exerts pressure on interpretation. If each update must feel like progress, ambiguity becomes intolerable. The trickster is not evil, he is amoral. He rewards what captures attention, and grief is luminous bait. Your duty under the trickster's reign is to become slow verify before you share. Resist the narcotic of refresh. Give your nervous system the quiet it needs to avoid participation in the crowd's fever. The wounded king is the nation itself, the symbolic sovereign, afflicted. In legends, the land and the king share fate. When the king is wounded, crops fail, rivers dry, beards fall silent. America's wounded king has been bleeding through successive crises, pandemics, riots, contested elections, attempts on leaders, mass shootings, social atomisation. Each new wound risks convincing the people that nothing binds them except fear and the currency of mutual disgust. But there is another reading. Each wound is an opportunity for the kingdom to recover its lost grail, that is, the capacity for meaning that's not derived from enmity. To retrieve it, one must pose the knight's question to the wounded king. What ails thee? Not, whom shall we punish to feel whole? But, what secret grief sustains this illness? After this assassination, the answer will include America's addiction to scorning its adversaries publicly for sport, its toleration of fantasy violence as entertainment, its degradation of university life into reaction theater, and its resignation to a political economy that monetizes hate at scale. Now, to the controversy you asked me to reach, the most unsettling Jungian reading is not that extremists on the other side willed this death. It is that the culture at large, across factions, unconsciously needed it. Not in the sense of a cabal, but in the sense of a mythic requirement, a martyr to mark the next act, a shock to reset attention, a sacrificial episode to justify escalations already desired. Listen to the speed with which this changes everything language arrived. The immediacy of demands pitched as moral necessity. The gleeful certainty among certain fringes that their apocalyptic prophecies were finally coming true. That hunger preceded the event. The bullet satisfied it. To say this is not to excuse the murderer, it is to indict the crowd. If you are offended, ask which part of you benefits from a politics forever on the edge of war. One more archetype circles overhead. The Avenger. He promises catharsis by mirroring the violence of the offender within the law or outside it. Leaders who speak of lowering the temperature fight the Avenger with the fragile weapons of restraint and grief. Others will ride the Avenger to influence. Citizens must learn to hear the Avenger in their own pulse and to lay down the intoxicating dream of punishment as identity. Punishment is sometimes necessary. Identity based on punishment is spiritual suicide. There is also the figure of the orphan, the young who watched this unfold, many of them first entering political consciousness. They have learned a terrible lesson. Speak, and you may be killed. That is not the lesson a free people can tolerate. The only answer that can heal the orphan is a culture that treasures courageous speech across divides and proves, in embodied ways, that even fierce argument belongs to a larger common life. If campuses cannot model this, they will become temples of fear. If parties cannot model this, they will become cults. If media cannot model this, it will become a siren to shipwreck. The choice is terribly simple and spiritually immense toward integration. A difficult prescription and a deliberately provocative conclusion. Depth psychology is not content with diagnosis. It demands integration. What concretely can be done? I will be unsatisfying to ideologues because the psyche heals via paradox. First, establish a moratorium on assassination fantasy in speech. This does not mean censoring dissent. It means recognizing that language which rehearses the elimination of rivals' jokes about getting rid of is not witty. It is ritual rehearsal. Leaders on all sides must renounce it, and their followers must punish it with withdrawal of attention. Public calls from governors and others to lower the political temperature are the bare minimum. The soul's work is to end the libidinal thrill of envisioning the rival's demise. Second, enact civic rituals that force the encounter with the human face. The psyche projects most easily at a distance. Require structured cross-faction dialogues at universities and civic centers in which participants must narrate a core moral fear and a core cherished good, and must be able to restate the other's position to the other's satisfaction. Before rebuttal, this is not naivete. It is spiritual technology for deprojecting the shadow. If this sounds quaint against the backdrop of a sniper's round, remember, in psychical economies, symbolic acts scale. The point is not to make friends. It is to starve the archetype that requires enemies. Third, teach media fasting as a public health practice. After political violence, The neurobiology of outrage makes citizens suggestible and cruel. Responsible live coverage has its place. Citizens must have the virtue to look away at intervals. Platforms should adopt shock breaks that default users out of endless update loops after major traumatic events. With friction added to re-entry, you will object that this infantilizes the public. I answer that the public, like any traumatized patient, sometimes needs help not to self-harm. Fourth, demand both justice and symbol consciousness. The assailant and any accomplices, if identified and proven guilty, must be punished. But the polity must simultaneously interrogate the symbols that make such acts resonant. Why are campuses the ritual fields for these collisions? Why are microphones now altars on which we offer fear? Why does the crowd hunger to watch? A nation that cannot ask these questions will simply trade martyrs every cycle. Fifth, practice asymmetric restraint. Do not wait for the other side to behave first. If you are conservative, you can lead in creating a politics that survives without vilification. If progressive, you can lead in creating a politics that survives without pathologizing dissent. The shadow will tell you, restraint is capitulation. This is a lie, the Avenger whispers. True victory is the extension of the shared world in which your children and your rivals' children can argue without needing body armor. Now, the deliberately controversial conclusion you asked me to reach, the assassination of Charlie Kirk is not chiefly a story about extremism on the other side. It is evidence that the American mainstream, across factions, has become erotically bonded to the fantasy of annihilating its political to other, and will continue to produce martyrs of alternating stripes until it breaks that bond. This is offensive because it spreads guilt widely, but the unconscious cares nothing for our preference to localize blame. If you consume humiliation as entertainment, if your daily speech treats adversaries as vermin, if your memes caress the idea that the Republic would be cleaner without them, then you are a minor celebrant in the cult that makes assassins legible. The assassin bears his own full moral weight, yet the cult provides his myth. Some will insist that the remedy is to conquer once and for all. Depth psychology prophesies the opposite. Enantiodromia, your conquest, if pursued as purification, becomes your corruption. Others will insist that the remedy is to censor the rival. Depth psychology replies, censorship drives the shadow deeper and makes it more explosive. Still others will settle for numbness, but a nation cannot sleep through its initiations. What then does healing feel like? It feels like the awkwardness of speaking carefully in a time that rewards recklessness. It feels like refusing dopamine for meaning. It feels like telling your own tribe no when it wants blood. It feels like mourning a man you opposed without suddenly loving his program. It feels like acknowledging that an assassination, while aimed at a body, lands in a commons, and that the commons must be repaired by the very people who hate each other most. And finally, this is the hardest it feels like, recognizing that the American story will either rediscover the art of living with rivals or end as a tragedy of alternating martyrs and escalating reprisals. If you want a symbol to carry from this day, do not choose the bullet, choose the throat. It is where breath becomes word. Guard the throats of your adversaries, as if the future of your own children depends on the sound of their rival's voice continuing in the air. Because it does.